Thank you. Good evening to everyone. This is the second session of the public hearing in connection with the 40B application for 648 Canton Avenue here in Milton. At the last session of the public hearing, we heard the presentation from the applicant developer. They pretty much laid out in fairly general terms all the various aspects of the proposed project, including a traffic analysis that was presented in fairly summary form during the course of the hearing. Just to sort of recap, let me put my glasses on for this, but to give you an idea, if I haven't said this already or you weren't on a previous session, I just want to give you the lineup of how we're going to proceed with this hearing. As I said, we started with the developer, and now we're going to move to peer reviews by various experts that have been engaged on behalf of the town. After we finish the peer review part of the public hearing, the plan is to turn to town representatives who will give their comments and concerns. They've already submitted some in writing to the board. After the town presents its information concerning various aspects of the proposed project, we'll next turn to neighbors and specifically to counsel for the neighbors, Mr. Corcoran, and they will present their case, including any experts that they have engaged to address the various aspects of the project. Once we get to that point, or maybe even earlier than that, but once we get to that point, the idea would be to see where we stand in conversation during the public hearing process with the developer to see how they want to proceed, whether they want to consider changes or alterations to the plan, or whether they want to move forward. But that's a ways down the line after we've gone through all of these other steps that I've just outlined for you. We, as I think the members of the board will all agree, that we're going to endeavor to consider every bit of information that's presented to this board in writing or during the course of the public hearings in the form of testimony or questions or responses to the questions. We know that we've received a great deal of information in positions from various members of the town, from council and the like, and we'll certainly take all of that into account. There's a tremendous amount of information for us to receive and to sift through. It's a fairly complicated project, and we'll do our best to make sure that we consider carefully all aspects from all corners of the town and from the development team as we do our job here in connection with this proposal. So with that brief prelude, I want to turn it over to the first of the town's peer reviewers, Jeffrey Dirk, who is, I know from my own professional life, is a traffic expert, and he will present his thoughts on the traffic situation as it relates to this project. And hopefully we'll have some time for him to take some questions from the audience, from the public, with respect to issues that they may have on their mind. I understand that Mr. Dirk has a time limit tonight, that he has to leave by 8 o'clock. And so we'll try and get as much information from him and through him as we can over the next hour. So I'm sorry for that long prelude, but I'll turn it over. Jeffrey, it's your show.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate your indulgence with regard to my schedule this evening. So as you mentioned, my name is Jeffrey Dirk. I'm the managing partner with Vanessa & Associates, and we were retained by the town to conduct a review of the June 2020 traffic impact study that was conducted by MDM Transportation Consultants. We've also provided comments with respect to the site plan. Our comments on the site plan are really focused on access, circulation, and parking. And when I speak of access, it is all modes of transportation. So we're reviewing pedestrians, bicycles, public transportation to the extent that there is any, as well as automobile traffic within the site. So we have a series of comments related to that as well. So focusing on the June 2020 traffic study that was submitted in support of the project, the first step, or our role as your review consultant, is to ensure that the study was prepared in accordance with all applicable state standards, as well as the industry standards for assessments for similar type of projects. And we've concluded that the study was prepared in accordance with all applicable standards. So that's kind of the first test that we have in going through that. The second thing is to look at the study area that was evaluated for the project to make sure that it's sufficiently large enough to encompass intersections and locations where the project, from the standpoint of the amount of traffic that will be produced, would have a pronounced impact. So locations where you would see increases in delay or vehicle queuing, or where there are existing safety deficiencies, areas within the town where there might be high crashes or high crash locations that may warrant some additional review as a part of the project. The study area that the applicant evaluated was essentially the Canton Avenue corridor stretching from Blue Hills Parkway all the way to Route 28 and the major intersections along that section of road. So as we're looking at sufficiency of study area, the first thing that we look at is the amount of or volume of traffic that will be produced by the project. So at 124 units, it's predicted that the project would generate somewhere between 45 and 55 peak hour trips. So is that traffic, and that's the volume of traffic over a 1 hour period in the morning between 7 and 9 and 1 hour in the evening between 4 and 6. So those are the volumes the project would produce. As it leaves the project site, some of it's going to go, we'll say, northeast or southwest on Canton Avenue. And so those numbers get smaller, obviously, as you get further away from the site, as the traffic kind of peels off and goes to various side streets and through intersections. What is determined in terms of a study area, Mass DOT defines a study area in general as locations where the project will add 100 or more vehicle trips during the project's peak hours, or where there will be a 5% increase in traffic or more. And again, those are just general guidelines to look at. The project doesn't produce 100 peak hour trips. So, we're below those thresholds. As we look at the impact at intersections the applicant had studied, that study area is more than sufficient. It basically encompasses the locations at the extremities at Blue Hills Parkway and at Route 28. That's where the traffic from the project is making decisions as to where it's going to go. So as I talked about dispersal, once it gets to those points, it starts to peel off and those numbers drop dramatically, so that you end up with less than 20 peak hour trips in any one direction. So that the study area is sufficient based on those parameters, because you wouldn't see impacts outside of those immediate intersections. And so we've determined that that's sufficient. The applicant conducted traffic counts at these intersections pre-COVID. And I think that's important now as we're looking at these traffic studies. So they were all collected in 2019 and projected to 2020, which is appropriate. The state now allows us, in conducting traffic studies, we can actually go back, because of COVID, we can go back 6 years and use data that's 6 years old and bring them forward. So this data is relevant. It's relatively recent, and the applicant applied appropriate adjustments. So we've concluded the data collection was done appropriately. We agree with the numbers and the methodology that was used by the applicant in conducting that. Again, as I mentioned, we're concerned about transportation, so that's all mode of travel. The applicant documented where there are pedestrian facilities, bicycle facilities, and public transportation access. There are sidewalks along one or both sides of Canton Avenue in this area. There are no formal bicycle accommodations, although some of the roadways are sufficiently wide so that you can ride a bike and a vehicle can drive beside you and not have to cross the center line. So that's a shared traveled-way accommodation. There is no public transportation access available to the site other than services that are offered by the Council on Aging. So that's not a mode that would be available, at least at this time, to residents of the project. So what that says to us, and the applicant's analysis confirms this, this is basically an auto-centric project. You're going to need an automobile to get around. So we don't have that opportunity of public transportation, direct access anyways, to the project site. The applicant looked at motor vehicle crash history at each of their study intersections, as well as along Canton Avenue in itself. What the applicant does, or conducting the safety analysis, is they compare the number of crashes that are happening at each of the locations based on and compare that to the volume of traffic going through the intersection. And that calculates to a crash rate. So it's number of crashes occurring per million vehicles going through the intersection. Mass DOT publishes standards for signalized and unsignalized intersections. So the applicant can compare the crash rates that Mass DOT publishes for this area, for the Milton area, and compare that to the crash rates that they've calculated for the intersections. And if it's above the state's crash rates, then it's determined that it may be a significant issue that needs to be addressed relative to crashes. One of the things that you're going to hear me talk about probably more than once on this is that in focusing on the crash data, is that the Canton Avenue Route 28 intersection is a high crash location. So the number of crashes that are occurring at that intersection is disproportionate to the volume of traffic going through the intersection. So you'd expect a lower number of crashes based on the volume of traffic. And so there's more crashes than would be expected. The other thing is that that intersection is actually listed on the state's database as a high crash location. So not only do the calculations suggest that it exceeds the state crash rate, Mass DOT has also determined that that intersection is a high crash location as well. So it's on the state designated list. So that's the first time you're going to hear about that, and we'll talk about that intersection again when we speak about the traffic operations analysis was done. So that's kind of the existing conditions, the safety assessment that the applicant undertook as a part of their investigations relating to existing conditions on the roadway network. So all traffic studies conducted in the Commonwealth are required to look at a 7-year planning horizon. So we have to look at traffic volume 7 years in the future. The applicant's traffic study was done in 2020. So their 7-year planning horizon is the year 2027. And they're looking at conditions in the year 2027, both with and without the project in place. And so the 2027 future year condition encompasses, or without the project, encompasses two components. It's just general traffic growth. So if no other projects were built in the town of Milton, but development happened external to the town, or just increased automobile ownership. So someone who's maybe 16, who's going to get their license within the next 7 years, adds a driver to a household. So those type of things result in increased traffic in and of itself beyond just development that might happen in the area. So that's general traffic growth. So the applicant looked at 10 years of historic data, and that suggested that growth in the town has generally been about 0.5% per year. So that's compounded annually. So they use that as a growth rate. That's consistent with what has been used in other studies within the town. So that we've confirmed that that is appropriate for this traffic study. The applicant also consulted with the town to determine if there's any projects along the Canton Avenue corridor or proximate to the study area that would change traffic patterns or traffic volumes at intersections. And based on the consultation with the town, as well as the state, the applicant determined that there were no additional projects that would increase traffic beyond that 0.5% per year growth rate. And so again, that's consistent with what we found in other studies that have been conducted in the town. So we are in agreement with that methodology. So that's 2027 without the project is essentially taking their traffic numbers and growing them 0.5% per year for 7 years. And that's what the year 2027 looks like in this area if this project's not built. So the next thing the applicant does is estimate the volume of traffic associated with the project. That is done using standard trip generation statistics. They're published by the Institute of Transportation Engineers. The Institute of Transportation Engineers basically collects studies that have been done at similar multifamily communities. And these studies have been conducted over 50 years, essentially, of data. The most recent update was published in 2017, so it's relatively recent. The database is continually updated, so the numbers that the applicant is looking at and using to estimate traffic for this project is relatively current. I would also say that we've used the similar numbers and then monitored similar developments to be able to see if, in fact, the trip estimates are equal to what is actually produced by similar communities. What we generally find is that the numbers tend to be higher than what the traffic projections based on the Institute of Transportation Engineers numbers tend to be higher than what we actually measure, which is a good thing. We actually want the numbers higher so that if we're assessing impacts, building improvements, that we're actually designing for something that's higher than will actually be produced by the project. So using the typical industry standards for estimating traffic, as I mentioned, the project's expected to produce 45 vehicle trips in the morning. So that's two-way traffic. In the morning, the majority of those vehicles are exiting, small amount coming in. In the evening, the project will produce 55 vehicle trips. And again, this is just over a 1 hour period. I just want to mention, because this often comes up as a question. So when I'm talking about the 45 or 55, so if we kind of graphed the ramp of traffic, so if I plotted between 7 and 9 in the morning, there's a 1 hour period between 7 and 9 when the graph would peak, and that would be your 45. And then it starts to go down after that peak. So that doesn't mean if the peak is, let's say, 8 to 9, that from 8:01 to 9:01, it might be 44 vehicles, but it's not 45. So that's basically with the way the peak works. This is the highest volume hour between 7 and 9. On either side of that peak, there's still obviously traffic being produced, but it's not at the same level as occurs during the peak. And so those are the high numbers that the project would be expected to produce. It's important the applicant uses those numbers. And then, so it's basically the peak of the project gets added to the peak of the roadway. So taking the peak traffic from the project and then adding that to the peak traffic on Canton Avenue at each of those intersections, it produces a worst case analysis scenario. So again, a peak on top of a peak, and then you analyze what the impacts of the project are and develop your mitigation based on that. And the applicant has done that. And so we're in agreement with that methodology. So the assignment of traffic to Canton Avenue, so trying to determine how much of it's going to go northeast, southwest, go through each of those intersections, turn left or right. The applicant looks at US Census data for journey to work. So if on the census, if you're a resident of the town of Milton, you obviously report, I live in Milton, but you also report, where do I go to work? And so the applicant can look at the data for residents of the town and determine, if I live in Milton and I work in Boston, then look at the roadway network and the traffic patterns and figure out what is the quickest way to get to Boston from this project site. And so they assign the trips that way. And they do that for each of the communities that are identified as employment locations for residents of the town of Milton. So that's how they develop their distribution of traffic on the roadway network. We've checked that data, the census data, as well as the applicant's estimates. Also reviewed that in relation to the traffic counts at the intersection. So even though we're looking at the census data to kind of bring it down to more of a local level, you want to look at your actual traffic counts. So we can look at each of the intersections, see how many vehicles are turning left or right, and see how does that correlate to the applicant's projections of how people might use the roadway network. And we've done that and confirmed their findings in terms of the trip distribution pattern related to the project itself. So the next step is assessing the impacts of the project. So we've estimated traffic volumes in the future. We've estimated how much traffic the project is going to generate, and then assign that out to each of the intersections. And then what we assess is motorist delays and vehicle queuing at each of the intersections to see locations where the project might have an impact. And based on that analysis, what the applicant has confirmed, or actually the applicant concluded, and we've affirmed these conclusions, is that, again, 45 trips in the morning, 55 in the evening, some of it turning left or right coming out to the site. As you get out to these intersections, what we found as a part of our review of their analysis is the project does not result in any significant impacts, meaning that delays are generally not significantly increased as a result of the project. The notable exception to that is the Route 28 intersection with Canton Avenue. So again, we're going back there. That intersection is currently operating or has movements operating at or over its design capacity. So again, focusing on that intersection, we have an intersection that's a high crash location. We also have an intersection that is operating above its design capacity. So the project, it's not going to make things any worse. However, the existing condition is basically at a point where there isn't capacity there to accommodate additional traffic demand. So even though the project doesn't make things worse, you already have an intersection that's a high crash location and has capacity constraints. So I mentioned that because as we're thinking, down the road about where there's appropriate locations for making improvements, that's certainly a location that should be high on the list of a location that's in need of safety improvements and some capacity enhancements as well. So the next thing is we look at the recommendations that the applicant has provided as a part of their assessment of the study. The applicant did make specific findings and recommendations relative to ensuring that sight lines are appropriate at the driveways that there's to the project site or the driveway to the project site. Also that there's appropriate traffic controls, both exiting the site as well as within the property itself. And then lastly, at the Canton Avenue Route 28 intersection, because that is a state designated high crash location, the first step in defining improvements is conducting what's known as a road safety audit. So a road safety audit is basically, I like to describe it as it's a design charrette where police, fire, public works, Mass DOT, the regional planning agency, and the town planning agency go out to that intersection and conduct a study. It's led by a group leader, so it's basically another traffic engineer essentially. And you analyze what's happening in terms of crashes at that location. And the end result of that really is a list of improvements that are recommended by the public safety officials, Mass DOT, and the planning agency and the planning department of the town to be undertaken at that location. And those improvements are ranked by cost as well as the timelines to complete those improvements. So it's short-term, low-cost improvements. So those are improvements that can be done in the short term, and they generally cost less than $10,000 for each of the items. And then there's intermediate term, midterm, or mid-cost improvements. So those are improvements that could be up to $50,000, and they would take maybe 4 or 5 years in terms of implementation. And then there's the long-term improvements. So those are really high-cost improvements, more at a regional planning agency. So I mentioned that again, probably more detail than is needed, but typically what we focus in on is the short-term low-cost improvements, because those are your safety improvements. So those are improvements that can be done immediately. They cost less than $10,000 for each of those items. And they are also the improvements that are determined to really result in the most benefit in terms of safety in relation to the cost. So it's a low cost, but it has a high benefit in terms of safety. And so as we had suggested to the applicant, there's a couple of things in terms of our comments. And one of those is that this road safety audit should be conducted prior to the issuance of a certificate of occupancy of the project. The applicant didn't say one way or the other in terms of the timing, but what we would suggest to you is that because we have a high crash location, that is probably a location that you would want to, as you're thinking about potential mitigation measures for the project, that road safety audit and then implementation of those short-term low-cost improvements should be something that we would suggest be considered by the town to have this applicant partake in advancing. Again, because we have a high crash location, overcapacity, and the project's adding traffic. Even if it's a marginal impact, there's still a location that needs to have some safety enhancements done to it. So that's one of the things that we've suggested as a part of our comments on the study. The other thing is that the applicant, we've suggested, should implement what's known as a transportation demand management program. Again, the site does not have access to public transportation, but that does not mean that we shouldn't be doing things to encourage residents to use public transportation. So we've listed out some specific things that we suggest the applicant undertake as a part of this project. Most of them are just making the residents aware of what's available in the area. But then looking at the site plan, we want to make sure that it's accessible for both pedestrian activity as well as bicycles. So those are two things that really need to be incorporated into the site plan itself. So we've made sure to recommend that also be undertaken. So we really didn't have a lot of comments on the traffic study. I think we had generally about four comments for the applicant to address, and 2 of those are related to mitigation. So, our overall findings relative to the traffic study, that it was prepared in a professional manner. It provides to you an accurate representation of the potential impacts of the project. The study area is sufficient to see where impacts may occur as a result of the project. And so really, other than the applicant responding to the comments that we have on the traffic study, it's really a matter of some site plan related issues, but those will translate into some things on the traffic study itself. So kind of transitioning into, actually, I'll stop there and see if there's any questions on the traffic study before I go through my comments on the site plans. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, you're muted.
You're muted.
Are we opening this up to the attendees yet? Or are we keeping this strictly with the panelists right now?
I think we can open it to the attendees. I think we can take some questions from folks that are here tonight.
All right, Mike Kelly. Mr. Kelly?
He's muted.
I know, but that's him.
I should be on now.
Okay. Good evening, Mr. Kelly.
You have to give me a microphone before I can unmute it. One of my concerns is that you say the traffic count was done in June of 2019. Was it done when school was in session?
So the traffic counts, I'll give you the exact date. The traffic study was conducted in or was published in June of 2019. The actual traffic counts, the traffic counts were done in October, so schools were in session.
All right, I'd like to know that because it's obviously significant traffic with the high school very adjacent to the area.
Right, yeah, it was actually October 23rd and October 24th to be exact.
My understanding from looking at and reviewing some previous traffic studies is the trip generation handbook, the ITE, they grade into sections. I don't know if they still do, but they previously had graded into sections A, B, C, D, and so on.
Correct.
And when you say there's no significant impact, I looked at a traffic study before that had probably 200 to 300 pages, and they made a conclusion on the front page. And the conclusion on the front page said there were no significant impacts, yet multiple intersections that I reviewed deep into the reading went from an A to a C, from a B to a D, from a D to an F. But yet the conclusion for most people who didn't want to read through the 200 to 300 page said, no, there was no significant impact.
Right.
Beyond that, I'd also like to know, I don't hear you mentioning anything about the intersection at Canton Ave and Guile Road, which is where the high school is.
Right.
I don't hear you mention anything about the intersection down near the police station. I mean, some days I come out of a side street getting onto Canton Ave, and some days the intersection at the police station is backed up beyond the entrance to this new potential new development at 648 Canton Ave. Do you propose that they put a traffic light at the entrance and exit to this facility?
So I'm not proposing anything relative to the project. The amount of traffic the project generates would not justify the installation of a traffic signal. But back to your point on the those gradations that you had mentioned. So yes, as I stated, that we're really looking at impacts on motorist delays and vehicle queuing, but that does directly translate into those letter grades that you had mentioned. So those gradations of A through F, with A being the best operating conditions, F being failing conditions. So we do look at that as well. The intersections that the applicant had reviewed as a part of this project, again, with the exception of the Route 28 intersection, the majority of the movements were D or better at those locations. And so those,
oh, D or better, that's good.
Yeah, so a D or better, a D is defined as the limit of acceptable traffic operations. So DOT says
you're sitting through multiple queues at the light if you're a D. You're sitting through multiple, you may sit there through multiple queues at the traffic light if you're a D. Again, I don't have the very specifics in front of me, but I mean, again, the point I made is the traffic backs up beyond the entrance to this facility. If you don't have a traffic signal there, you're going to have a hard time getting out with a maximum of 45 to 50 cars in any given hour at the heavy peak traffic in the morning, unless there's very kindly people, which would either cause traffic accidents or you need to put a traffic signal there just to get yourself out.
So I mean, all I can say is we did look at, the relative impact of the project. And so that's what I had mentioned in terms of increases of delay of queuing. And you're right, it doesn't mean that there isn't queuing happening and that the queuing doesn't back up. So I don't dispute that.
I'm disappointed that you say that the intersections that were studied would be a D or better, given that the only way to go from a D is an F. And as you described it, that's a failure. So, I mean, with the 0.5% a year without the development, is that where we would be at, a D or better?
Correct. Yeah, that's correct. With the exception of 28.
You say without the development, we'd still be at a D or better.
Correct.
Presently, the intersections are at D or better.
Correct. With the exception of the Route 28 Canton Avenue intersection, that's correct.
So just understanding the traffic literally being involved in it daily here, I would agree with that because like I said, it backs up quite a distance from the Parkway. It backs up quite a distance from the police station. Just in the years I've lived there, I've had a much more difficult time just getting onto Canton Ave. But if we're presently at D or better, I can't understand why this development wouldn't cause intersections to fall into an F.
Well, I think to some extent it has to do with the dispersal of the traffic I had mentioned, because it's not 45 trips going through one single intersection. It's dispersed as it gets away from the site.
Yeah.
The thing is, I mentioned, it's not all going in one direction. So that it's not like, I hate to use the example, it's not like a bunch of Amazon vans leaving their facility all at once where they're releasing 45 vans. It's not like that. The traffic is very dispersed as it leaves the project. Some of it's entering, some of it's exiting. So it's going in bi-directional. And then as you get away from the site, it gets small. Those numbers get smaller and smaller.
Is there a reason that we didn't talk about the intersection at Guile Road and Canton Ave and the intersection down at the police station on Thatcher and Canton Ave? Is there a reason why we didn't talk about those?
So I just went through, if there's a,
Well, I mean, you seem to go down to Rich.
Excuse me, if there's a specific intersection that you have a question about, you can ask me or ask the applicant, and they can look up the numbers for you.
Is the last question, I promise, is the traffic study completed, or is, I heard somewhere early on that it's in the initial stages, or is it completed?
Oh, it's completed.
How would one go about getting a copy of that?
I believe it's on the town's website.
I believe it is.
Okay.
Mr. Kelly, thank you. Thank you for your questions. You hit some interesting points. Anyone else that has questions for Mr. Dirk?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Ned Corcoran.
Oh, fine, Mr. Corcoran. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff, for your analysis. I think it's helpful. Couple of questions. If you, given the, what as you described, the nature of the project as car dependent, have you considered any other TDM strategies to address the implications of the traffic volumes coming from this project?
I did, in terms of like a shuttle service or things like that. No, I mean, that's really, we've encouraged the applicant or suggested to the applicant that really we want to have some pedestrian and bicycle connectivity. So the next step up from that would be public transportation, shuttle service or things like that.
Have you considered I'm sorry, given the narrow cross section through this section of Canton Avenue, particularly between Guile Road and Thatcher Street, have you considered whether or not there any safety improvements should be considered to make bicycle traffic transportation safer through this section?
We haven't suggested that as a part of our review.
Given the lack of access to public transit and relatively limited availability for bus service, and given the distance between shopping, this location and shopping and other accommodations, would you consider this site to be underparked relative to the volume of parking that's proposed for the project?
We have suggested as a part of our comments on the site plan that the applicant increase the amount of parking on the site. I mean, it's not a significant increase, but we've suggested that at a minimum, it should be at least at 1.52, which would add, I think, a few extra parking spaces to the site. So we have provided some recommendations as a part of our review of the site plan that the parking be increased.
As Mr. Kelly indicated, and I think as the evidence bears out, there is a substantial queue of traffic daily from at least the Thatcher Highland Street intersection back beyond this driveway and to Guile Road. Have you performed, or should the applicant perform any queue observations or gap studies as part of its analysis?
The applicant could certainly undertake that if that's a concern that the neighbors have and that, the board has as well. I mean, certainly it's not something that's going to hurt. The only thing I would suggest is, if the queuing is somehow related to the school, you would just want to make sure that, that we're getting some realistic measurements. So to the extent that it's helpful to everyone to have that done, it's just really a question of, would they be out, if they went out there tomorrow, would they be looking at conditions that, Mr. Kelly and maybe you've experienced out there, or is it affected by COVID and the volumes and the queuing just is not present?
In fact, we've got some recent evidence that, at noon, middle of the day, today, last week, volumes were queued from Thatcher Street back to Guile Road at noon. And question whether that, you have any concerns about that relative to safety for traffic entering Canton Avenue from the site drive for both left-hand and left turn and right turn movements.
Certainly, if there's queuing past the driveway, then that's something that the applicant should should review, because it would impact sight lines coming out of the site.
Do you think it's appropriate to evaluate what we would think of as a third peak, which would be sort of afternoon, after school, after high school traffic volumes that come particularly between Guile Road and Thatcher and Highland Street?
It would depend. I think one of the things that the applicant can do is to look at their traffic counts on Canton Avenue and determine, I think as you're mentioning, if there is a third peak that's happening, is to be able to determine what the volume of traffic looks like at that third peak in comparison to the peaks that they analyze, so that they can then report back and say, as I mentioned, did they analyze the peak condition? Or is there a peak that occurs outside of these typical hours that's equal to or greater than the peaks they analyze? So I don't think that that's unwarranted to look at the data and see if there is a third peak occurring, and then for them to provide an opinion as to whether that's a condition that equals or exceeds what they've analyzed.
Saturday is often busy day for residential communities. People coming and going for lots of other trips that they may not have the opportunity to take during the week. Would you suggest that they perform traffic counts and consider impacts for a Saturday peak?
For residential projects, and this is not a hard and fast rule, we generally look at the commuter peak hours. And the reason that we do that is because it's not necessarily because the project in and of itself generates a high volume. It generates a high volume of traffic during those time periods. But generally what we find is, even if the project generates a similar volume of traffic, and what we find is generally the weekday evening peak hour number, so that 55 is pretty close to what the Saturday midday peak hour would look like. The real question is the volume of traffic on Canton Avenue the same Saturday midday period? Is it higher or lower than the weekday evening peak hour? And so
Maybe I can.
So they would need to analyze it if in fact that is a worst case condition. So I think it's one of those things, sort of as we were talking about the third peak on a weekday, is to have the applicant undertake a traffic count out there on a Saturday and then be able to say, okay, the project generates this amount of traffic on a Saturday. Canton Avenue has this amount of traffic on a Saturday. So again, it's that question of, did we analyze a peak condition, and is Saturday peak equal to or higher than the weekday peak? So I think that's certainly a relevant question to be asked.
And I'm wondering, in relation to that, whether a peak hour analysis with speed analysis, it's one thing to say that on a weekday morning during a peak hour that you've got stationary to very slow moving traffic, where on a Saturday you may have a peak hour where you've got higher speed of traffic, but an equivalent volume of traffic that's proposed to enter into Canton Avenue from the site. And that's a different condition, but maybe a separate safety condition.
They should do, if they're collecting the data, they should do both. So it's speed and volume.
Okay.
Can I just jump in just for a sec? And Mr. Corcoran, I don't mean to interrupt you, but my concern is just where Mr. Jerk has to leave at 8 o'clock. If there's more to his report that he hasn't been able to give the board yet, I would just want to make sure that he had an opportunity to do that. So I'm not trying to cut you off, but Mr. Jerk, did you have more of your report that you hadn't gotten to yet?
I had some comments on the site plans.
My last questions are related to site plan, so I can pause there.
Sure.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
We also have two attendees that are requesting to speak. Do you want to?
Yeah, can we just limit them to a relatively short time frame? And if we can pick up at the end before Mr. Jerk has to leave, we will. So why don't we hear to the two attendees that are waiting?
He's not there now. The O'Donnells were just there.
Okay. Is there someone else there?
No. There is
Fine,
not.
well,
I'm
why don't we
sorry.
have-
I don't know. They left.
Okay. Why don't we have Mr. Dirk finish up on the balance then of his peer review report?
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we have a few comments on the site plans that were put together, and I'll kind of talk about the more significant of those comments. So the first one is the relationship of the access to the project site to Gulliver Street. So right now, the access is offset by about 40 feet or 60 feet if you measure from center line to center line. The 40 feet dimension is essentially what we call it's the closest curb line to each other, because we measure that distance because the shorter distance, the 40 feet, is really where you have interaction between turning movements of opposite. So Gulliver Street is opposite the project site. So we want to know how close they are in terms of separation of those conflicting turning movements. So if you looked at it from the standpoint of, a right turn exiting both of those streets at the same time, or left turns going in or out of those streets, what you'll see is if they're close together, those turning movements start to interlock with each other and start to kind of inhibit the ability to be able to make a turning movement into one of those streets. The separation is also the desired separation is based on the speed of traffic along the roadway itself. So as traffic, as I think Mr. Corcoran or Attorney Corcoran was mentioning, as speeds are higher, you want more separation between intersections because you need adequate sight lines to have a vehicle exit, see a vehicle exiting from another street, and make reactionary maneuvers. So based on this offset of about 40 feet, what we've said is based on the speed measurements that the applicant has undertaken, the offset is not sufficient enough. And that what you need to have is either line up the two access points, so line up the driveway opposite Gulliver, which because of the frontage of the property, it's not really, I don't think they can really do that. So because of that, then there's a minimum separation that needs to be attained. That minimum separation is 75 feet. Based on Mass DOT guidelines. So that would suggest the driveway needs to shift to the southwest of where it's currently located. So based on the speeds that the applicant measured, which is between 35 to 40 miles an hour, the Mass DOT guidelines for separation of access points when they're located opposite each other is a minimum distance of 75 feet if they cannot be aligned. And so we've suggested in the site plan, they need to make that adjustment in order for the access points to function in a safe manner. So that's kind of, we'll call that major point number one with respect to the access point into the property. The second point is also related to safety. And this will really, it's our review of codes, but ultimately your fire chief, fire department has the final say on this. Based on the number of units and the length of the roadway that is serving the project site, we've recommended that a secondary access should be provided for emergency vehicles. Again, that's kind of our review of the code. However, your fire chief is the ultimate authority as to whether a secondary means of access is required. The general rule of thumb is that you want to have a single point of access serve no more than 30 dwelling units. And again, that's a really rough rule of thumb. At 124 dwelling units, that, again, the fire code, as well as based on the unit count, would say that you want a secondary means of access. So again, that's our review of code. The fire chief has the ultimate say because there can be things that the applicant can do as a part of the building construction with sprinklers and other things that the fire department and the fire chief may make a decision that this single point of access is sufficient for them for life safety reasons. But from our standpoint of advising you, we would say a secondary means of access is something that should be pursued as a part of the project. The other comments that we have do relate to the access. Again, we generally want to have, as you're approaching Canton Avenue, you want to have what's known as a leveling area. So if you don't want a steep incline or decline coming up to Canton Avenue. So as the vehicles are coming up and they need to get to the stop sign, You want it relatively level, so as we have wintertime conditions, vehicles aren't sliding, that they're able to kind of gain traction and stop. So you want that to be level. It also affects sight lines. If you don't have a leveling area, then a motorist really isn't at the same elevation as they're sitting in their car as Canton Avenue and trying to look to the left or right. You want them to be relatively level in that area. So that leveling area is 2% or less, basically. And so we've suggested to the applicant that it appears that their slope coming into Canton Avenue would exceed that leveling area. And we've said that it should be 2% or less within 50 feet. So that's 2 car lengths, because we heard kind of Mr. Kelly as well as Attorney Corcoran mentioning about the queuing past the driveway. So there will be queuing in the site itself. So we'd like to have queuing space in a leveling area for at least 2 vehicles to come up and then wait behind each other to make a turn onto Canton Avenue. So we've suggested that that should be undertaken as a part of kind of a review of the site plan itself. The rest of the comments pertain to kind of standards. So sight lines at the driveway, we'd like to see those actually plotted on the site plan so that we can understand where the applicant, to make sure that they're not placing any signs, landscaping, or other features within those site triangle areas, and that those are always kept clear. So you really want to have those on the site plans. That helps the building inspector or the code enforcement officer to make sure that nothing's placed in those areas and it's readily identifiable if they bring the plans out to the field. And then lastly, we've suggested the applicant should increase the parking supply for the project. Right now, they're providing parking at 1.5. We've suggested that the parking ratio should be something closer to 1.52 or more. So we've asked that they look to increase the amount of parking on the site itself. So that concludes our review of the project and our comments on the site plans. Again, the 2 major things on the site plans are relocate the access so that there's a minimum separation of 75 feet to Gulliver Street, and then that leveling area on the driveway, and secondary means of access. Again, that's something the fire chief should opine on, but taking all of these things into consideration, would require kind of a re-engineering of the site plan to make sure that those separation happens, the leveling area happens, and then if the fire chief wants a secondary means of access, again, that would need to be looked at as well. So that concludes my review of the traffic study and the site plans. And again, I'm happy to stay for questions as long as I can.
I guess we have about 10 more minutes to Beverly, do we have any other folks?
Yeah, yes, we do. I found the O'Donnell family. They're back on.
Okay. Have we lost them again?
Yeah, like apparently. I'm sorry.
Are there any other?
There is Kathleen O'Donnell.
Okay.
Good evening.
Good evening, Kathleen. How are you?
Good, how are you? I just have a quick question for Mr. Durker. Mr. Dirk, thank you very much. When you look at the traffic areas, we do have a proposed project on Blue Hill Parkway called the Ice House.
Right.
And we also have the Tamposis. These applicants have another project on Blue Hill that is under construction or under consideration by the boards. Canton Avenue is actually, there are very few east-west cut-throughs through Milton. And so traffic from those 2 sites will also be using Canton Ave and leading into Reedsdale. So is there a way to sort of to consider those traffic impacts in this particular project?
So we did look at that, and the actual, particularly the Ice House, and when we, I think we presenting or discussing traffic on that, I think later on this month on that, but that project has an intersection in common in their traffic study. So the Blue Hills Parkway intersection and Canton Avenue is studied in both of these projects, and so we do know the volume of traffic from the Ice House that goes through the Blue Hills Parkway intersection is actually relatively small, and it would be included in the growth rate the applicant used. That project isn't that large in terms of the amount of traffic that it's producing. So the growth rate the applicant is used in this study is reflective of the increase in traffic the ice house would have at that intersection. But we are reviewing that traffic study as well and have provided comments to them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Beverly, anyone else?
Tim Sawinski?
Hi, Beverly. Thank you. Two quick things. Just as a reminder to folks that are in the sort of listening audience, if you've put a question into the Q&A, please try to raise your hand and ask it. We haven't really have the capacity to monitor those written questions. So if you've got a question in the Q&A, please just raise your hand and ask it. I did have a question for Mr. Dirk. First of all, thank you for your analysis. Regarding the parking ratio, understanding that, the recommendation is a relatively slight increase in the number of parking spaces. What is the consequence of not making that change? Given sort of, the relatively isolated nature of the project site as it relates to any kind of on-street parking or whatever. What would be the consequence of leaving the parking ratio where it is?
My thought on the parking ratio is that this is probably a location where you do want to have, a reasonable increase in traffic parking be above the 1.5. And I think that we've suggested a few extra spaces at this location. It's certainly, I would not advocate for a parking ratio of 2. I think that's way too, it's too high. Studies don't suggest that that's required. 1.5 is generally kind of the low limit that we would suggest in a suburban area with a lack of access to public transportation. But generally, if we're including parking for guests, as well as people that are prospective tenants, things like that, that's where we would like to see something on the higher side of the 1.52, 1.6 range. So we've suggested just a modest increase in parking. It's kind of a balancing act of looking at the increase in impervious area and everything that goes along with that, and trying to right size the amount of parking. But I do agree 1.5 might be a little low for this site.
Thank you.
Is that it, Tim?
That's all I've got for now, except to say I did take note of the secondary access point issue, and I'll be running that question by Chief Madden, and he'll have an answer for us in a couple weeks.
Great, appreciate that. Are there any other folks waiting, Beverly?
Ned has his hand up again.
Yes, Ned.
Thank you. Couple of quick follow-ups. With respect to the on-site design and the triangle evaluation at the intersection with Canton Avenue, what type of measurement, how would you recommend the applicant go about measuring those site angles or identifying those site angles?
So there is a standard that is followed in measuring those site angles. So basically, you assume the motorist is sitting or in their vehicle distance 14.5 feet back from the edge of Canton Avenue. So you basically measure back into the site 14.5 feet, and that's 1 point. So that's where the driver is. And then the site triangle extends out into Canton Avenue. So you're looking to a motor vehicle that's approaching you, both traveling northeast bound or southwest bound on Canton Avenue. And that distance is set based on the measured speed of traffic on the roadway. So I think they're measuring somewhere close to around 40 miles an hour. So that's going to determine where that vehicle needs to be positioned on Canton Avenue to define the other part of the site triangle. So there is a set criteria. So they'll plot that on a plan, and then we will review it to make sure it was done appropriately.
Would you be concerned in that regard regarding the presence of stone wall, dense vegetation on each
Absolutely.
side,
Yes.
telephone poles planted within?
All of the above.
sidewalk?
All of the above. Yes, absolutely.
One other question, if I may, Mr. Chairman. I know that you are performing these peer reviews for the other 40B projects in town, and in particular observed your testimony at the 582 Blue Hill Avenue project. I know that one of the issues that came up over there was a study of the intersection of Robin Street,
Right.
which connects between Blue Hill Avenue and Canton Avenue, just to the south or southwest of the intersection with the Parkway. Do you think that, given that, should the Robin Street intersection with Canton Avenue be studied as another intersection here, taking into account the volumes of traffic that would be anticipated coming from the Blue Hill Avenue project?
It does seem a little bit removed from the project site. Again, it's one of the things where the applicant certainly has sufficient information to be able to say how much traffic this project would add to that location. So again, I think it's certainly something the applicant can answer with the information that they have available as a part of this project. So I don't think it hurts to ask the question. Absolutely, because then we would know how much traffic this project adds to that intersection, as well as the other project. So again, I think that whole idea of the cumulative impacts, at least then we'll have that understanding. I think it's worth asking the applicant just to opine as to what is the traffic volume increase that will occur at that intersection. That would inform us as to whether further analysis is required.
Okay. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Corcoran. Yes, Beverly, sorry.
I'm sorry. We have a phone call. I
Okay,
don't know who it is, but they do have the hand up.
okay. Mr. Dirk, you have time for one more?
Absolutely, I do, Mr. Chairman. I'll stay on as long as I can.
Okay. Go ahead, Beverly, why don't you put that person through?
Yep. They need to unmute. There we go.
Okay, hi. My name is Janice Madden, and we've lived on Canton Ave for 40 years, so we've been around more than any of you other guys. Listen, I read this traffic impact analysis, and to tell you the truth, they did the traffic impact thing for 2 days, October 23rd and 24th of last year. I mean, wow, they spent a lot of time, if you ask me. The thing is, that street, Canton Ave, is so busy in the morning. I mean, it really starts at 6:30 in the morning because you've got trucks trying to, get into town or, whatever, get to the highways. I mean, it's a racket in front of our house. Then come like 8 o'clock, 6:30, 7 o'clock, 7:30, 8 o'clock. Those cars are just stopped dead in front of our houses on Canton Ave between Thatcher and Giles Road, say. And, we have to breathe in the fumes. I mean, this isn't even healthy. The carbon monoxide, it's really pathetic. But in spite of that, I just got something else to say besides the traffic. We've got, listen to this one. It indicates their TIAS, whatever that means, capacity analysis, indicates that their project will not result in any consequential changes in intersection operations compared to a no-build condition. They've already said that. Also, they say the proposed project is walkable to Milton Center, which includes the town hall offices, town library, bus stops, also within walking distance of the high school, and Milton Hospital, town, and various houses of worship. I don't know anybody who walks to the hospital. And I don't know how many walk to the Council for the Aged. You can't, obviously the developer doesn't live in Milton which was once a quiet bedroom community. There's nothing within walking distance. You have to get in your car and go to the grocery store, local pharmacy.
Seems we've lost the connection, Bev.
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Jerk, is the time come for you to go?
I can stick around if the board has any questions.
I'd rather have them come from members of the public if there is any left. Probably anybody left?
There. Oh, we got Cheryl. Out of time.
Well, let me ask Mr. Daver and Mr. Brown if they have any questions.
Cheryl is on. I'm sorry. Cheryl.
Yeah,
Chagayas.
I'm here. It's Cheryl Tagayas at 660 Canton Avenue, and I'm asking a question as a resident. I would like to understand how school buses might impact the traffic situation. They're the closest elementary schools are not in walking distance, and so the elementary students would most likely be taking the school buses. So could you speak to that, please?
Well, so when school buses are present, they pick up and they put their red lights on and traffic stops. And so, that will happen to the extent that, it'll happen. They'll stop at the access to the project site. I presume that they're already picking up students along Canton Avenue at the various roadways. So this will just be another stop, I guess, on their travel route. So, it's an extra stop that's going to need to take place, but I as to whether that's going to impact traffic any more than it already does on Canton Avenue, probably not, other than it's going to be another couple of minutes to get children on the bus at this location.
Mr. Dirk, the pickups right now occur on the side streets.
Mhm.
There are currently no pickups along this section of Canton Avenue. I've lived here for 22 years. My children attended all the Milton Public Schools, and there's not been any pickups along this stretch of Canton Avenue.
So so no one getting picked up on the south side of Canton Avenue? And again, I'm just asking the question.
They're picked up from the side streets, so not on Canton Avenue themselves. So I'm just curious
Oh,
if,
okay. So the bus it's not going to pull into the development. And I'm presuming the school department does not want the children crossing Canton Avenue. So the bus would need to stop at the access to the site unless the school department determines they need to cross the street and they're going to get picked up at Gulliver. But I'm not sure what their policy is. And I'm hesitant to say that they would want children crossing Canton Avenue to get picked up at Gulliver.
I'm just curious whether you see there's a safety concern with this situation.
I don't think there's a safety concern with the buses stopping on Canton Avenue. It's, as you said, it's a matter of convenience. The school department would need to weigh in as to how they're going to pick up at this for this project.
Thank you.
Anyone else that's waiting for a question? Probably anyone raising their hand?
No, not right now.
All right, then let me, again, I'll ask Mr. Brown and Mr. Daver if they have any questions.
I have a quick question, I think, Mr. Dirk, if you still have the time.
Absolutely.
And this may be just for my own edification, and it's kind of a broad question about your calculations, but when you're calculating the increase in traffic over a period of years, so for 7 years in this instance, you assign a 0.5% increase, and you also look to the town to ask about larger developments that might increase that number. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you take any other criteria into account, such as increased traffic in the more general geographic area? For example, increased population in Boston and increased traffic on the highways, things like that?
Yeah, that's actually captured in that growth, the 0.5% growth rate. That's what that attempts to capture. And it's just that, from the standpoint of what the Metropolitan Area Planning Council uses for, their future growth models when they're determining roadway improvements and funding allocations, the 0.5% per year is pretty consistent with what they use as well. And that is incorporating all of the things that you just mentioned.
Thank you.
Mr. Daver, any questions?
I guess I have one question if you have time for one.
Absolutely, yes.
And it related to something one of the earlier gentlemen said, Mike Kelly, and it's really, I guess, partly for just my own edification. He was talking about the grading of the traffic conditions A through F, and how C is considered acceptable traffic. And he was saying that acceptable traffic, and I was just curious as to whether this is true. Can that mean waiting through several light cycles? I mean, is that what? Because it didn't have definitions. I mean, I saw
yes, you're 100% right. So a D or better is generally defined as a limit of acceptable traffic operations. And so if you wait through multiple light cycles to get through, that is not acceptable, and that would not be a D, because your delays would be
We have all the time.
much greater than that. So just on, order of magnitude, if a D would be that you're generally waiting, 35, 45 seconds at an intersection to get through. So if you came up to a traffic signal, you're going to make it through in one light cycle, essentially would be a D. If you can't make it through that one light cycle, assuming the traffic signal is timed appropriately, then that is not considered an acceptable condition. The same thing if you come out to an intersection and waiting at a stop sign on a side street, and you're sitting there for more than like a minute, that's not acceptable. That would be a failing condition. So that's how you would perceive it. If you wait and can't get through a traffic signal on one cycle, it's not acceptable. That would be a failing condition. The intersection's over capacity because it can't process all of the traffic that's physically there because you didn't make it through the traffic light. So it didn't process all the traffic that arrived. And the same thing at a side street. If you're waiting there like a minute or more to be able to get out of your side street, then that would not be an acceptable condition.
The grade of D is considered acceptable?
It is. It's the limit of acceptable traffic operations in an urban area. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, well, it seems like we've covered all the questions that have been raised this evening.
Ryan,
Mr. Drake? Yes?
we have more attendees with questions.
Okay. Mr. Drake, how much time do you have left?
I can stick around for a few more questions.
Okay.
All right, this is Beth.
Did you say Beth?
Hi, this is
Beth.
Elizabeth Janiga.
Elizabeth, okay, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
My name is Elizabeth Janiga. I live at 658 Canton Avenue. I've lived in Milton 18 years. I've lived in this home a little over close to 11 years now. In terms of not impacting traffic significantly, and the issue brought up about what is unacceptable for having to wait for a light change, there is no question in the morning when you pull out onto Canton Avenue and from my driveway, our private drive, making a right-hand turn, I can wait several light changes to actually get through the intersection down by the police station. In terms of what qualifies for significant traffic, in the time that I have been here, over the years, they've had to put in a left-hand turn lane down by the police station there and by Thatcher. And over by Unquity, at one time, there was no traffic light. That was a four-way stop. So we have had, in the time that I have lived here, which is significantly less than many of the neighbors that have already spoken, the traffic has significantly increased in Milton. And I still find it very hard to believe that the argument you're making that adding 200 plus cars is not somehow going to be a significant impact. We're already having to wait more than 35 seconds, more than a minute, simply to get through a traffic light. There has been many times when I have to make a left out onto Canton Avenue, and I am sitting there for at least 30 minutes waiting for somebody going northbound to let me out, and then I have to slowly inch out and wait to make sure that I don't get hit in order to make that complete left turn. So I'm really having a bit of difficulty understanding what the word significant here means. I'm supposed to ask a question, so I guess you could explain what significant means again to us.
So the project is going to produce 45 trips during the morning peak hour, 55 trips during the evening peak hour. So as that traffic is dispersed from the driveway out through the intersections the applicant studied, what we're looking at is what is the increase in delay or vehicle queuing that's caused as a result of the project. We're not saying whether the intersections are currently operating, at an unacceptable level. If they are currently operating at an unacceptable level, what we're looking at is how much worse does the project make that? And so that's in terms of what we're saying in terms of a significant increase, that's what we're measuring is in terms of how much worse does the project make those conditions. We're not saying whether the conditions today are acceptable, but the relative increase in traffic and the relationship to increase in delays that is results from this project's traffic, it doesn't change significantly. But again, it's not saying that you have unacceptable conditions at some locations.
Does that answer your question?
Well, no, I already knew what the traffic was here. It really doesn't. I still don't believe, I don't do the numbers and you are the expert, but I find it very difficult to believe that this amount of cars coming out is not going to impact traffic in the morning. I just find that very hard to believe. As the one woman mentioned, it's a 2-day traffic study. These people don't live in Milton, and I, like all the neighbors, just don't believe that this is not going to more significantly impact what we already have.
Mr. Jerk, would it make sense for the applicant to do a study of that Thatcher Street intersection under current conditions, sort of confirm what we're hearing anecdotally? And I can tell you, I've lived in Milton for 35 years. I don't often drive down that way during the week because I take the train, but it's busy, and I know that Thatcher Street intersection can be difficult even on a Saturday morning. Would it make sense to study that intersection to see how it's performing under current conditions?
So the applicant did look at the Thatcher Street intersection with Canton Avenue?
When you say look at, is that different from actually studying it?
No, they've done a full analysis of that intersection as a part of their study.
And what were the conclusions that they reached with respect to that intersection's operation at peak hours, morning and evening?
So that was not a location that I had identified based on the volume of traffic going through the intersection that it was over its design capacity. So
They did not.
They did not. No. Oh, I'm sorry. So there are specific movements. I'll correct myself. The overall intersection was a D, but there was a specific movement. In fact, the northbound movement, so this would be Canton Avenue northbound, I believe, was at its design capacity. So that would mean, yes, delays and queuing related to that is shown as a part of their analysis.
When you say it's at its design capacity, what does that mean?
That means it's basically if you add additional traffic above and beyond this project, that it would basically trip into an overcapacity types of situation. So it's that glass full. So the water is basically at the rim of the glass. And if you add another drip into the glass, it would start to overflow. So the glass is full.
In that, I'm sorry, was that under existing conditions or positing the project?
It's actually future no build, so without the project, and then that obviously that will continue with the project in place. The project kept it at an E. It didn't trip it over into the water flowing out of the glass, which is the F. So basically it's at its design capacity, and maybe it was, close to its capacity. And then you add the project's traffic and used up the rest of that reserve capacity. So now it's kind of glass full.
Okay, that's helpful, Mr. Dirk. Thank you. Any other questions while we still have Mr. Dirk available?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, if I may, before Beverly turns it back over, I don't want to take anyone's time away from the public, but our traffic engineer from MDM, Robert Michaud, is on the line, and I don't know if he has any questions or responses to Mr. Dirk's analysis. But I just wanted to let you know that he is on the line in case you'd like to hear that while Mr. Dirk is still here.
Okay. No, I don't think I'm going to, well, I don't have any questions for him directly this evening, but thank you for that, Mr. Sherman. But why don't we just continue? I'd like to get as many people who are on the line who have questions done before Mr. Dirks leaves.
Okay, 1105 ABCD's up.
Yes, John Hajar. I live in the Indian Cliffs neighborhood. And even in this time of coronavirus, where more people are working from home, I notice traffic is backed all the way to Gile Road sometimes. This past week, I waited 4 light cycles to get through the intersection at Canton Ave and Thatcher Street. And it's just getting worse and worse. I think the only solution is to add a turn lane, but I think that would be difficult to do given that there's wetlands there on the, what would that be, the south side, as you're heading northeast, or on the east side, excuse me, yeah, across from the police station, across Thatcher Street and the police station, whatever corner that is. I don't know if that could be done, but I mean, the traffic is terrible. Just to travel a mile can take you 20 minutes. It's really horrible. Just wanted to state that on the record. That's all.
Thank you. Beverly, anyone else? No? Doesn't appear that we have anyone else that's on the line. Okay, well, Mr. Schomer, just to go back to your question before, I'm sure we'll hear from your folks again at some further point in time. But I think for tonight's purposes, we wanted to get the full benefit of Mr. Dirk's opinions and study, and have as many people on the line as we could to have questions and commentary with respect to his analysis. And I think we've done that as much as we can, at least for this evening. I assume, Mr. Schomer, at some point in the future, we'll probably hear more from your traffic people in response to what's been said tonight.
Chair?
I believe that Mr. Corcoran, when it gets to be time for the neighborhood to make its full presentation, that he has a traffic expert engaged who will speak and have I'm sure some additional thoughts on the situation and the impact of the project. So I think we will deal with traffic a lot over the weeks to come, and get a lot more information helpful to the board. So, Mr. Dirk, thank you for being with us, and free to go.
Yeah.
Have it all right.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Excuse me, we have 8 hands up.
Mr. Dirk, have you departed?
I'm still here, but I really do need to go. I'm kind of
All right. Last question. Beverly, this is the last question for tonight.
Okay, Lara Loesch has been on hold.
Okay.
Mr. Dirk, I actually have 2 questions. The first being, have you evaluated, or has the applicant evaluated bicycle safety on Canton Avenue? Because I think that at one point it was mentioned that at certain points on the road, it is wide enough for bicyclists. However, I can speak firsthand to traveling on Canton Ave very often, and I noticed that when you are passing a bicyclist, you must come to a complete stop and then wait for there to be no traffic coming in the opposite direction to then go around that bicyclist. So I'm wondering, has there been any consideration given to traffic to safety for bicyclists?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where, as you mentioned, there's not a uniformity in width, that there may be sections of it that might have the appropriate accommodations, but certainly it's not wide enough that you could stripe a bike lane or something like that on the roadway, because it's just the uniformity, the width doesn't allow for kind of consistent bicycle accommodations along the road.
So does that raise safety concerns then, or?
I would say that looking at there's not a history of motor vehicle crashes related to bicycles. So does it raise safety concerns? It would suggest that, you couldn't stripe Canton Avenue to accommodate bicyclists on the roadway itself. Bicyclists are allowed to use the roadway. It's a public traveled way, but you couldn't stripe a bike lane, I think is all that we would say. There isn't a history of motor vehicle crashes relating to bicyclists on the roadway.
Yeah, so you're saying specifically on Canton Avenue, there's no history of.
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
that may also just be because you never see anyone riding their bicycles on Canton Avenue because there's not enough space.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's
so
right.
you just don't see anyone other than children on sidewalks
Right.
riding bicycles. So I think clearly that's why there's no history of bicycle
Right.
incidents.
No, you're 100% right.
Yeah. My second question being, Mr. Chair, Beverly said there's 8 more hands up. So what is the protocol here since Mr. Dirk has to exit for the evening? What's the protocol for any additional questions?
I guess what I would suggest, the only thing I can really think to do is to have you submit those questions in writing to the board. And I'll do what I can to get them answered.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I could certainly, if I gather up questions specifically directed to Mr. Dirk, then I can forward them to him, and I'm sure he'd be happy to answer them to the best of his ability. Some of those questions may come up in the context of others who speak or testify before the board, and I have in mind certainly. I understand that Mr. Corcoran has a traffic expert, so maybe that person could answer them as well. But for the time being, if you just want to put those, send an email to Beverly Sutton with a specific question, I'll do all that I can to make sure I get it into Mr. Dirk's hands and get a response. And then once I have that response, I can read it into the record of these proceedings when we're on for a public hearing.
Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, Mr. Dirk, this is it. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good night.
Well, I think that's really all the business that we had planned to cover tonight. Just by way of preview, Judy Barrett, can you tell me who we're anticipating will be here next week?
That's what I was just looking at. It will be Tetra Tech for the site civil review.
Okay.
Sean
So-
Reardon.
And it'll just be the one.
Yes, and then architectural review is the following week. Tuesday night
Alright.
again. Yeah, we're on Tuesday schedule. So Sean Reardon next week for site civil and Cliff Bomer for architectural the following week.
And that will conclude the peer review aspect of this public hearing.
Yes, sir, unless the board decides it needs additional assistance, in which case, you may need an additional peer review from some other discipline.
Okay,
But-
we can think about that as we go through, but for the time
Right.
being, that's what we expect.
Right.
And even if we did decide to get an additional peer review assistance, that would probably have to come later in any event.
Mm-hmm.
And so then just so everyone knows what we're up to, then I guess at that point, once we have these next 2 sessions with peer review information presented, that we would move then to the town's presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll go from there. I guess that's the plan.
Yep.
We'll get to you someday, Mr. Corcoran. We haven't forgotten you. Your presentation, we know that's in the wings somewhere.
Mr. Chair, my understanding is that we may follow the town's presentation.
That was the plan.
Might be the sort of April 13th, give or take.
Somewhere in that vicinity, yes.
That's what I have on the schedule tentatively, yes, Mr. Corcoran.
Right, great, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for participating tonight. I think we had a lot of good questions, good information, and we'll continue, I'm sure, to pursue this traffic issue. I understand it's an important issue, and we'll continue to keep it in mind. But we'll see you all next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Brian, I'm sorry, Chair.
Yes.
With everyone still on with their hands up, they can all submit their questions in writing to me.
Right.
Yes, they can. And they may, just to be clear, they may have later opportunities to ask those same questions. Certainly when Mr. Corcoran's people, his expert testifies, maybe he can answer some of those questions. So I
Yes.
think there will be additional opportunities to address traffic questions. But again, my recommendation is that they send specific questions to you, and I will in turn pass them on to Mr. Dirk.
Yes. Okay, I just want to make that clear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and good night to all.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.